All right, greetings. My name is Logan Therrien. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Kieri Solutions. With me, I have Matt Albers, who is our assessment team manager, and Jonathan Weadon, who is a high-performing lead CCA that performs the majority of our quality assurance. And today I want to talk about preparing for a DIBCAC High assessment and then being involved with it, and kind of just a quick intro into what our roles have been. I have performed lead as a lead assessor during Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessments, where we do assessments hand in hand with DIBCAC for organizations that were seeking certification. And that was prior to NIST 800-170 it was prior to 32 CFR Part 170 being implemented, where third-party assessments were occurring. And then Matt Albers also performed as a DIBCAC assessor, so many assessments under his belt from the government side. And then Jonathan Weadon, he has performed as the one being scrutinized by DIBCAC while Kieri Solutions went through our own DIBCAC assessment twice, which we successfully passed, again, due to his experience and tenacity. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Matt to kind of lead the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Logan. Just to reiterate something that Logan said, I did come from DIBCAC, so I have quite a bit of experience on the assessment side and the way that DIBCAC sees things. Now, that being said, all of these opinions and the things that I say are that of my own opinion. It's not the way that DIBCAC feels. I don't speak on behalf of DIBCAC or anything like that. I'm just speaking about my experience, the things that I've learned over time, and the things that we get from our consulting clients and the things we hear in assessments as we, go through these things each and every day. So one of the first things that I want to bring up, and one of the things that hit teams the hardest when it came to assessments, was documentation. We all know that we have to have documentation, but the level of documentation that you need to have prepared for a DIBCAC assessment is far greater, in my opinion, than those for a C3PAO assessment. And the reason I say that is because there isn't an opportunity for you to go through and make a ton of changes to any of your documentation if something isn't correct. You're going to have a chance to correct a couple of things, like maybe you said 15 instead of a 10 or something like that. I believe the adage was 5 changes. Is that correct, Jonathan? 5 total changes to your documentation, but no technical changes could occur.
Correct.
Yep.
Right.
So,
and add to that, I think 5 technical changes, or sorry, five administrative changes, 0 technical changes. And there's been some situations where you have to figure that out on the fly, which direction you want to go. Do I want to face a failure, or do I want to change some kind of, it's very clear when you get to there with the way to go, but you do have to follow your change management process, so you're not stepping on your own toes getting through that issue as well.
absolutely.
In my conversations with the DIBCAC members, there was some disagreement whether or not that meant you could change 5 documents, or there are 5 times you can change however many documents you need to change. I would strongly suggest that you ask that early on in your engagement.
Yeah, you could bring those kinds of things up well before the assessment begins. There's quite a bit of communication that happens between you, DIBCAC, your lead, and things like that in preparation for that assessment, and that's a great time to ask questions like that. Typically, they will get those answered for you pretty quickly. Something else that in relation to documentation, and something that I've kind of noticed a trend per se, is that people will come in there and say, yeah, but I'm doing it. Isn't it important that I'm doing the work, that I have the settings configured, that I'm protecting the stuff? Why do they care so much about me writing about it and writing this novel to say I'm doing this great thing when I'm actually just doing the great thing? Can't you look at it and say, yeah, they're protecting it? Unfortunately, no. The government wants documentation. They almost want it more than they want the actual implementation. That's not true. They do want you to implement it. But they focus on that documentation very heavily. If you say that you're doing something a certain way, you have to be doing it that way, period. There isn't leeway for you to shift left and right. Yeah, we sometimes do it that way, but that doesn't fly. So you have to be prepared.
Matt, I'm sorry, just want before we move on, because this is important, I think, and that there's a reason why that occurs, right? And that is the assessment objectives themselves. That's a requirement that the assessors have to validate, right? When they identify, define, describe, right? So that can't really happen without some kind of documentation to refer to, right? So that seems like the assessment wouldn't be able to continue without that written down in a policy or procedure.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially on the C3PAO side. On the DIBCAC side, they're going to continue the assessment whether you write about it or not.
Sure.
They're coming. And that's a great point though. These ultimately 320 objectives. If you write to each of those objectives and you answer every single one of those questions, then it's less likely that you're going to be asked additional questions, follow-up questions, clarifying questions, versus if you just write to the 110 requirements. We've seen a lot of people who come in and say, hey, here's my SSP. I've got 110 entries here as an example. And then we start looking at it and we say, all right, well, you talk a little bit about this. Now I got to jump to this policy and read about all these things in this policy and see if you meet it. And it's easy for things to get lost. If you're not speaking to each objective specifically and you're just talking about the requirement, things get lost. And in a DIBCAC assessment, you can't afford for things to get lost. That's not the time for that to happen. So that's, documentation, point one. I think we beat that one as far as we can here.
Actually, I do have a question on this. So
Sure.
For DIBCAC, I know in the CMC community, in the 800-171, under the 170, part 170, we refer back to the NIST 800-171 and 171 alpha, but we're also use the DoD CIO's CMMC assessment guide for level 2. Does DIBCAC use that guide as well?
Now, DIBCAC sticks to the 800-171 alpha. I mean, that's what they are using for everything. They do use the assessment guide for understanding how each objective is to be assessed and what kinds of things we're looking for, but they don't really step into that CMMC documentation like we do.
Okay, that's good to know because there's additional information in those guides that you wouldn't find in 171 or 171 alpha. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's great information. If you're in this space and you're looking at 800-171 alpha, you might as well look at CMMC and all that other stuff too, for extra definitions, extra, FAR clause information, things like that. There's all kinds of data in there that if you don't dig into it, you don't know it exists. All right, next point. When you're being assessed, which is one of the most important parts during an assessment, is you're asked a question, you answer the question, you stop talking. That's the flow. Once you have stopped talking, your assessor is going to take that information you've given them. They're going to determine whether or not that's enough information. And I promise, if it's not, they will ask for more. If they don't need any more information, they won't ask for more. If you continue to speak and give them information they may not need, that introduces risk. You answer the question, you stop, you let them ask any additional questions they have, answer those questions, and then stop. At that point, if they at any point, say that your trending met, don't say anything else. The buck stops there. Move to the next requirement. We don't need, I know that you have a lot of pride in all the things that you do. I know you want to talk about it. I know you want to say, yeah, but look at these other cool things I'm doing. It's not the point. Point is, meet the intent, move on. That's it. I want to keep that one simple. Does anybody else want to say anything to that? Keeping it simple here.
I can just say I struggled with that one during our assessment. It was very hard for me to stop talking as somebody who's paid to talk all day.
I'll tell you this, out of all my DIBCAC assessments, everyone wants to talk. They love it. The silence is tough. It's a weird thing to be silent, especially if you're in a room and you're all sitting together. It's much harder than in teams when you can mute yourself and now you're silent even if you're saying stuff, right? But when you're sitting in the room with DIBCAC, that silence it's tough. It's hard to not want to say, and we also do this. Oop. Tell me more about that thing, right? That's where you can, introduce some risk. So say what you need to say, stop. Let them tell you they need more. The next one is practice. Please practice. At least go through, do a self-assessment, go through every single control. Have someone who, sits there, asks you the question, answer it, go try to find the evidence, show it live. Maybe take a screenshot so that you know how to get there again. The reason I say this is because if you come in front of an assessor and they say, can you tell me how your authorized users come into your environment? And you say, you know what? I think we have a policy for this. That's suspicious. That's strange. You should know that policy. You should know how people come in. You should know how devices get added. You should know all of your environment. The point of this is that you have done all of the work to be considered, secure, basic, security there. You have implemented all of this and you should understand how it works. You should be able to speak to it, show evidence, and you should be the subject matter expert on what you're presenting. If you're not, then your assessor is going to be suspicious. They may want to ask more questions. They may want to see if you truly understand what it is you're talking about. So practice. Make sure you understand what you're talking about. If you don't, get somebody in the room who does. It is important to have somebody who understands exactly what is supposed to be said and nothing more, what is supposed to be shown and nothing more, and staying on that topic for that objective. And that's it. And to do that, practice, practice, practice. If you find yourself in 311 and you're talking about stuff in a completely different domain, yeah, we do this, and then we got some training, and then we do all these things. And let me show you the training that's all completed. That's too much. Let's talk about the process. Show me the process. Here's the process. Here's what we do. Great. Now let's move to the training. There's a flow that they're going to want to go through. So don't try to do it yourself. Let them control the assessment, and you control the information you give to them during that assessment. And then the next,
I have two things to add to that really quick, just my experience and ways that I've seen this go wrong. And one is having the right person in the room that can answer those questions. Especially, so a good example is where being able to pull logs, right? So you're expecting them to be able to pull an event that happened and show that they can pull those logs. And I've seen where the person with the hands on the keyboard can't do it, doesn't know how to operate the system. But throughout the process, it has been told to us as the assessor that this is the person that does it daily, right? So how are they doing this daily when they can't do it now? That's one good example. But the other part is being able to understand how you're going to present that information because of the wording. And I think a great example of this is when we go back to maintenance, that the requirement for performing maintenance on organized systems, provide controls for tools, techniques, mechanisms. And so when you get into those words and you're being asked, all right, so how do you control the mechanisms to conduct the maintenance? Well, I told you that a minute ago. You told me techniques, right? So being able to understand how you're going to answer those specific assessment objectives with the wording. And if you're having those practice sessions, you may actually find yourself stumbling to answer the question or talking in circles, and somebody can provide that feedback to you. So then you have to go back, clarify, what does that word mean to me? How am I going to put it in a sentence? Just kind of show them a picture instead.
Absolutely. Jonathan, you have anything else you want to add to from the being assessed side, from the side where you're the one who's being grilled and asked 1,000 questions? Well, 320 questions.
Well, in terms of practice, right, I've always said, especially when it comes to DIBCAC, but even with the C3PO assessment, preparation is key, right? Review all your inventories, review all your baselines, even if it's not officially time to do so yet. As you said, run your self-assessment. Review all your ticket queues, look at all the changes you have pending, the service requests you have pending, not just so that you have them for good evidence, but because you're about to spend a week in a high-stress situation where at the end of every day, they may be asking you for additional information to be submitted through screen grabs, and you might be working, as we did for one of the days of our assessment, until 8 or 9 p.m. doing that. You don't have time to do the ticket queues that you're not doing from 8 to 5 as a result of the assessment. So try and have that as clear as possible beforehand. And get the practice in. Like you mentioned, grabbing logs, go through whatever audit log procedures you have, run some of the most common logging captures that are likely to come up during the course of the assessment. Your assessor can say that they want a specific log captured. Make sure that you can grab that log. None of them should be anything too terribly surprising to you. Hopefully you already have a procedure for all of the logs that would pertain to any of the controls in 800-171. Also, one of the things that we noticed with DIBCAC when it comes to documentation in particular is they were very specific about inheritance. They wanted assessment objective level individual inheritances for every single item that we said any level of inheritance for. C3PAOs will often get a little bit wishy-washy with it and say, yeah, you can just say that you inherit a significant number in AC for this based on this third-party application, whatever. We will assess it more specifically when the assessment comes. DIBCAC wanted all of that prepared prior to our first face-to-face Teams meeting. But yeah, that I agree. Practice is important, and the documentation is important. That shows that you practiced.
Yeah. Yeah. One other thing I want to mention too is when we talk about those subject matter experts or having the right people in the room, that extends to people like consultants, making sure you have, or at least somebody you can reach out to say, hey, DIBCAC is asking me for this objective, and I don't think that's right. And you know what? DIBCAC specifically states they're not going to defend the wording that they're assessing against, right? They're not going to say, they're not going to argue with you on that. However, we know that there are maybe 10 different ways that you can satisfy a certain requirement. So there isn't, it doesn't have to be done any one very specific way. So if you're doing something in a way that does meet the intent of the requirement, and you don't have a good way to articulate that to your DIBCAC assessors, then that could create risk and potential for trending not met for something that you may actually be meeting. You just don't know how to present that to them in a way that's digestible or in the language that they're looking to receive. So having someone in your corner, or at least, somebody you can reach out to in the event that that happens, so you can be given the correct wording, is really important, because you don't get to go back and do it again. Once that week ends, that score is what you're going to get. And so it is important to make sure that that score is what you want it to be once it lands.
Yeah, and DIBCAC was very good about telling us what families were going to be assessed on what days. And we were able to have like our VCISO standing by on the days that we expected that he might be pulled in, people who had performed tasks in the past, because our assessment came at a time where we were changing our IT team personnel. So they were very good about that. And for the assessors themselves, when you talk about following what they state, I found DIBCAC assessors to be just like any other assessor. Some of them want more information than I would ask for. Some of them want less. Some of them interpret controls differently than we do. And it can be stressful when that happens, because the escalation path is shorter with DIBCAC. In our assessment, we had one assessor disagree with us on one particular control, and we escalated it to the assessment team lead, and they agreed with us, and we were able to walk away from that. But there wasn't much past that if the team lead had agreed with the assessor.
Yeah. That's why it's important to have someone in your corner who understands this language, has been speaking it for years, and can articulate it in a way that makes sense to an assessor.
Mm-hmm. Were those all your points?
I had. Yeah, those were the main things. Those were the keys. And honestly, they seem simple, but they are some of the main reasons we find, or we used to find in DIBCAC, that people would fail assessments. Preparation was everything. Having enough evidence, good, clean, organized evidence, was an indicator right away before we even arrived that this may go well. If you gave me an SSP and 3 screenshots before I arrived, we were in for a long week, and we knew it, right? So the amount of evidence that you provide ahead of time, that documentation is important. It provides a little bit of, trust or something in the assessors that you might be doing something right. If you've given me 100 documents, your SSPs, 300 pages, etc., it gives me a good feeling, at least, that you've addressed all of my concerns somewhere in these documents. Versus if you give me an SSP and 3 screenshots, you're going to be missing something. I'm almost certain. Maybe not.
Well, a couple of other items that I took away from our DIBCAC assessment, right, were we've beaten the horse that this is scary, this is stressful, but we also found them to be very accommodating. They couldn't always be accommodating to us, but they always tried. They were respectful of our calendar and who we could have available and when. They were helpful in the execution of the assessment itself, and they showed a level of flexibility that I've not always seen in government entities. I definitely appreciated that about them. In terms of what you said about practice and what I said about doing inventories, we practice what we preach, right? Eat our own dog food, as Amira used to say all the time. And that means that we use the cybersecurity maintenance checklist that's built into our consulting products, the KCD and KRA, where we're reviewing this thing on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, biannual, and annual basis, and documenting the steps of what we did, even if otherwise there would be no proof, no documented proof that we had, say, reviewed our vulnerabilities for that particular week. Something that often in an assessment, you're digging around looking for some sort of meeting notes or something. So in fact, it came up so often that they would ask a question, I would open my mouth to answer, and they would interrupt me going, oh yeah, that's in that cybersecurity maintenance checklist where you monitor that. Right, got it. And we would move on, and it met so many controls. And again, that goes back to the practice, and you're saying that they appreciate documentation sometimes even more than the actual accomplishment of the requirement. And In terms of the actual assessment itself, this is more generalized information. It's not specific to DIBCAC. I strongly suggest that whoever is running it from your side have multiple monitors. You're going to be running a conversation with your own internal team and teams on one side. You're going to be talking to them, and then you're going to want to have your SSP and some information about the control you're being assessed on and any supporting documentation on another screen so that you can speak using the same wording as your SSP so that you never accidentally conflict while you're speaking out loud to the person. You're speaking the exact words out of your policy, out of your procedure. You sound like a subject matter expert at all times, even if, maybe your vCISO could have spoken towards it a little bit more specifically, if they weren't available in that particular moment. Then choose one screen and share the screen. I suggest you share the entire screen, not a window of the screen. Our assessors were appreciative at DIBCAC that I wasn't trying to show a window instead of the screen and then having to shut it down and reopen a new one and then potentially saying, well, what about what I say over here? And they can't see the mouse anymore because it's on a different document. That breaks up the cadence of the conversation so much. And then I can control this one monitor and always interact on that monitor. Just don't try and drag a document from your right screen to your left screen if your center screen is the one that you're doing the conversation on. The last item that I wanted to make sure to mention to take away from our DIBCAC was every time they want a document from us, they always sent us 2 DoD SAFE links every time they needed one. If they needed 3 documents, they would sometimes send us 6 links. Save the spares. They definitely came in handy later on in the assessment. I was very glad I had them. They last typically a week.
Yeah, I got one more thing I want to say to something that you mentioned, and then I'll pass it over to Logan. Let's make it 2 things. The first thing that you mentioned was meeting minutes. Oh, I cannot tell you how many times we're in assessment and people are just digging for meeting minutes, trying to find it on their calendar. Go do it now. Make a list of when you did all those things so that you can go back and reference it. Collect all the meeting minutes and put them in a folder. Just get organized, because when you're digging around and trying to find that stuff, it looks unorganized. It's strange to us, and it lowers our confidence level in your ability to speak to those things. And so that's something I wanted to kind of mention there. But I'll just leave it at that one. That's all I got.
So we're talking about confidence, the assessor confidence, right? And then we talked about evidence, and I think that's important too. Is the more risky or the more dependent it is on an administrative control, you have to be prepared to present probably additional evidence, right? So I've identified something here. Here's a picture of what I do. You really can't. That's not non-refutable, right? It is what it is. However, we do this because I tell people not to do it. All right. Let's go ask a bunch of people, right? So what's that depth of evidence collection, whether it's through interview, test, or examine, that the assessor is going to be digging in. So be prepared for those things as well. So I kind of want to talk about a couple of things, and one of those is between a level 2 assessment, so a CMMC level 2 assessment, and a DIBCAC High assessment. What is the difference in POA&M on the opportunity to do a POA&M? So plan of action milestones. And just to be clear, for those who don't know, a POA&M in CMMC is defined in 32 CFR 170. And that's basically, I didn't get perfect, but I've shown that I'm secure enough to get a 180-day extension to be able to wrap this up, maintain a score in SPURS, and continue to be eligible for contracts to get to that 110 perfect score, right? So that's what a POA&M is in terms of CMMC level 2. Is that eligible to be conducted in a DIBCAC assessment?
It used to be. And then when I was transitioning from DIBCAC to here, that last about month or 2 before I was leaving, they had stopped. Well, actually, it might have been more like 3 or 4 months. They had stopped doing them. They weren't doing any more POA&M closeouts. The score that you got was the score that you got. I understand that they were potentially considering some changes. I don't know where they stand on that. I don't want to speak for them or misrepresent anything that they're doing. But at the time, they weren't doing those anymore. So right. I couldn't give you any more than that. I don't know why they weren't doing them specifically.
That's my understanding too. And my experience is that the C3POs, we were generally doing the POA&M closeouts under joint surveillance. and then,
Yeah.
and then getting DIBCAC's concurrence. So we were still doing more of that effort. And I understand DIBCAC just doesn't have enough time in the world to go back and reassess every organization that they've assessed. Right. So that's some benefits if you get the choice to do a level 2 CMMC assessment versus a DIBCAC. One is free, funded by taxpayers. The other one's also funded by taxpayers through contract support. But again, most of that revenue or the expenditure of funds and resources is being compliant, right? So if you have the opportunity, and I think this is not a guarantee, but most of the situations where I've seen where a company has been approached by DIBCAC saying, "Hey, we're going to come see you in a few months to do a DIBCAC High assessment," the company has been given the opportunity to perform a CMMC level 2 assessment instead, in lieu of. And now have an opportunity to have a POA&M if they need to, and then so it's a different level of availability, which may open them up for, again, additional benefits if they choose to go the CMMC level 2 route rather than a DIBCAC High. And DIBCAC is manned, how they're accordingly, so they may actually appreciate that opportunity to pass that off to a third party to conduct that work. So again, there's an opportunity. And Jonathan mentioned the communications part. My experiences with DIBCAC is if you communicate early and often, they're generally pretty generous about flexibility, right? So, hey, we are actually shut down that week. Do we need to come in? If it's moving a week, I've seen where that's happened. Again, no guarantee, but communicating early and often sure opens the door to a lot of possibilities to flexibility. A couple questions though. So, for just if the difference have you seen as a DIBCAC assessor and even a level 2 assessor for the companies that have had training, CCA training, CCP training, have you seen any difference in their outcomes?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this. So quick story. When I was at DIBCAC, they don't certify you in CCP and CCA. You have to go do that on your own if you want it. They have their own training program. So CCP and CCA were not really on our minds, so to speak. As a DIBCAC assessor, we were trained to do a job. We knew the job and we did it. We get very similar training, and it's more focused on, kind of the whole process, the way the government likes to do it, that kind of thing. But in that process, what we noticed was in some of those DIBCAC assessments, there would be somebody in there who truly understood CMMC, or no, sorry, not CMMC, 800-171 alpha. They truly understood it. And they were able to speak to everything. They were able to correct us in some cases and say, hey, by the way, that's not what this requirement's talking about. If you read it carefully, it says this. Do you see the and right there? That kind of thing. They truly understood it. Now, after the assessment had ended, we asked them, hey, how long have you been doing this? What's the deal? They said, oh, I've got my certifications. I've already gone through everything. Like they put me through this so that I could be prepared, so that I could speak to this, because I didn't know what the heck I was talking about when they said, you need to do this thing. You have to be compliant with this DPARS clause. And I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I asked them to train me. They did. And that was the highest scoring assessment that I had ever participated in DIBCAC, period. And then on this side, the C3PAO side, when somebody comes in on your team and they have that certification, or somebody who has that, or has at least been studying up on it, let's say, those people tend to, one, the assessment goes quicker because the evidence aligns better with what we're looking for. The interpretations are more clear and in alignment with what the way we interpret things. They know what they're looking for evidence. They understand our terminology when we're asking for things, that kind of thing. They're just way more prepared. They're able to answer questions. And when we would say, hey, I need to see this is trending not met, they would typically say, you're right. That is something that you need to see. We'll get that taken care of. We'll find that evidence. It exists somewhere. Give us a day. We'll get it up. We'll get it uploaded. So having that training makes a big difference. I couldn't probably quantify it. I don't have any research data to give you, but I would be willing to bet that anybody who has somebody who has that CCP, CCA knowledge is going to do better than somebody who doesn't. But there are always outliers.
Right. There's a cost to being certified CCA and CCP, but that's not a requirement to be certified. You can still go through the training. And a lot of companies have a lot of training partners, authorized training partners. So you can find the Cyber AV marketplace can provide usually a 40-hour training for each one of those levels, CCA and CCP, and then you don't need to get the certification if you don't want to, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to be an assessor. In fact, as a company, there may be risk to having folks getting certified assessor while they're part of the organization. So, I think that probably falls along the line of consulting too, right? Usually consultants have one form of those certifications and experience too. So if the OSC has a consultant with that background that's supporting them through the past, I've generally seen better outcomes as well for both DIBCAC assessments and for level 2 assessments. So, I just want to follow up. We at Kieri Solutions, we do provide consulting. We are a certified third-party assessment organization. We've performed 171 assessments. We've performed CMMC level 2 assessments. We've helped companies prepare for level 1 self-attestation, level 2 self-assessment, level 2 third-party assessments, as well as DIBCAC assessments. And we have a pretty good success rate. We do have availability to support your company. And we also have products in our Kieri compliance documentation, which is a 70% administrative solution for policies, procedures. If you are a small, medium, or even a large size company to come in and support your organization in that readiness process, we have a good success rate. And then we also provide something called a Kieri reference architecture, which is the other 30% of that solution for the technical side of building a Microsoft either GCC High or GovCloud environment that's supported by that documentation. And again, we have success. We've seen OSCs get through DIBCAC High assessments. We've seen OSCs get through CMMC level 2 assessments, and even as they're on their journey to level 3 preparation with our team. So thank you both for joining me today. I appreciate your time. If you want to get more information, you can either email us at info.kieri@kieri.com or go to kieri.com for more information. Matt.
Yes, and one last thing, if this video helped you at all, helped you kind of prepare for your DIBCAC assessment, your audit, anything that's coming up, let us know. Give us a comment, something like that. I want to hear about it because I like to know if we need to, make a better video, give you more information. If there's other information you want to know about these kinds of things, tell us, let us know. We'd be happy to make some more content.
All right, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jonathan. Follow us for more.